Why, hello, my loves, and welcome back to Spook Manor. Would you care to join me as we follow a young man who took the wrong train to the right place? It is a cold winter night in New York where our story begins. 17-year-old Lionel Stewart is a stressed-out teen who is quickly losing faith in the meaning of life. As you can imagine, being from a poor area near the railroad tracks has its many troubles. The possibility of gang violence and street crime was always something he had to be cautious of as he moved about the city streets. School had its own issues. Though he was very smart in many regards, the stressed out and overburdened teachers had failed him academically due to their workload and low pay. He wasn't the best looking or most popular either. He was a normal youth with a lot of potential, yet was in a declining mental state. Often he would let his mind and social media get the better of him, losing hope in humanity by spending too much time on his phone, rather than taking the time to see the goodness of the people around him in the real world. A deep depression took hold about a year ago, and Lionel was about to make the worst decision of his life. He walked through the park on a dark, snowy night. The landscape was eerie, oddly quiet and muffled, despite the distant city noises which surrounded him. He stared up at the Hell Gate Bridge, which stands over 1,000 feet tall. The steel arch design resembles that of a castle, with massive medieval towers on each end, causing people to often joke that the bridge would be the safest place to go in case of a zombie outbreak. Also known as the New York Rail Connecting Bridge, or the East River Arch Bridge, it sits on the north end of the East River between Astoria, Queens, and the Randall's Islands. Built in the 1900s, with construction starting in 1912 and ending in 1916, it is an amazing fact that no lives were lost during its construction. Lionel glanced up at the arches and wondered what it was truly intended to look like. He had heard once that it was supposed to be a very specific color called Hellgate Red. But due to a flaw in the paint, it began to fade and became blotchy before they had even finished painting it, leaving it a pinkish color that you see today. Moving through the thick falling snow, he finally made it onto the bridge and walked down the tracks. He knew he was trespassing, and the bridge wasn't safe for pedestrian use, and he simply didn't care. Death by train would likely be easier than what he was about to do. When he made it onto the center of the arches, Lionel looked out across the snowy city and down into the icy river below. This view is always so peaceful at night. So many people are going on with their lives, he thought to himself, and his is coming to an end. He took a deep breath of the harsh air, closed his eyes, and prayed for a reason not to do this. Yet in his misguided mind, this was for the best. He believed he had no future, and ending his life would lift a burden from his parents who were already struggling to make ends meet. They won't have to worry about him anymore, and would now have more time and energy to focus on his little brother and sister. A tear rolled down his weather-burned cheek as he thought about how much he loved them all. He then began to climb the slick railing, preparing himself for the fall, and hoped that this would be painless. He took one last look at the foggy lights of the city as he prepared to make the jump. But then, a sudden, intense gust of freezing wind blew fiercely into his chest with great force. It was harsh and knocked him off balance. Losing all awareness of up or down, he felt the back of his head slam hard into something, and everything went black. Lionel lay there in the darkness for a moment. He thought the fall would have lasted longer than that. Perhaps he had hit one of the trestles on his way down, he wondered to himself, and noticed that he felt no pain at all. With blurred vision, he slowly began to open his eyes. He appeared to be in a small space with a dim light. It was then that he heard a man's voice call out, "Picked up another one, Johnny. Looks like we can move out." Someone in the distance hollered, "All aboard!" and a train whistle cried out. He felt movement and could hear people whispering all around him. As his vision cleared, he realized he was in a railroad passenger car, and a conductor stood over him with lantern in hand. "This is not your car, son," the conductor stated. He then pulled Lionel to his feet before adding, "Follow me." Looking at the car's passengers is a strange sight to behold. Morbid faces sat waiting hopelessly in their seats, many dressed in different period clothing. Several people in Revolutionary War attire were tied or chained to rocks and are soaking wet. One of them was mumbling. She stared up at Lionel with a terrified gaze as she said, "It was the British. They did this to us." Another man sat in a 1960s suit with a gunshot wound to the back of his head in traditional mafia execution style. There were several other people sitting around in clothing that reflected later eras. They too appeared to be victims of the mob or of a sadistic killer, such as in the case of Robert Martinez, who received 99 years for taking the life of another man in 2015. As Lionel and the conductor moved to the next car, Lionel looked around to see ghoulish teenagers in groovy attire. They too were staring off in some kind of daze. He remembered hearing there were rumors back in the 1970s that a serial killer lived beneath the bridge. Rebellious teens would dare each other to climb the bridge to taunt the crazed man. Sadly, though, there were many cases of accidental falls and deaths as a result. The bridge was designed this way, though. With a mental institution on Ward Island, the residents of Astoria feared the disturbed might escape and hide out in the towers. Thus, the original design of the bridge was changed to make it much harder to climb. As they reached the third passenger car, the world around them became much darker. The temperature dropped fiercely, as though they were in some kind of an ice box. The wind outside the windows looked like black, icy water swirling about them. Lionel could see his breath as he followed the conductor down the center aisle. These people had a grotesque appearance of corpses. Their faces are sunk in, pale gray and bluish in color. They sat soaking wet, some with chunks of ice hanging from their hair and clothing. They passed one very thin woman holding a newspaper. She stared at an article as though hypnotized. Her clothing reflected that of a factory worker from the 1940s. She was mumbling to herself with a sad expression. "Maybe now they will notice me." The next was a wealthy-looking man in a 1930s business suit. He sat staring down at a letter in his hand with a terrified look of shock upon his face. In a horrified yet whispered panic, he said, "I've lost everything. The market has crashed. I've lost everything. It's all gone. It's all gone." Lionel stopped and looked around. All of the people in this car had taken their lives by way of the bridge. But it was then that the conductor spoke up. "Here you are, my boy. This is your seat." With that realization, he needed to confirm. Slowly turning to the conductor, Lionel asked, "Am I dead?" The conductor handed Lionel a cell phone and motioned for him to sit down. There was a movie playing on its face, a movie about his life. He saw all the happiness he brought to his mother, father, and siblings. He stood around laughing with his friends. All of his fondest memories were flashing by on the small screen. But then, it all changed. And he saw all the sadness his death had brought, all the grief, pain, and suffering that he had caused. Lionel became overwhelmed with regret. How could he have been so stupid, so selfish? There must be a way back. No longer willing to accept his fate, he jumped up and began to run back towards the front of the train. He heard one of the passengers holler out, "The train will let us all off at midnight." But Lionel didn't care. He wanted to get off now. He wasn't ready to go to the other side just yet, and was certain that if he stayed, the next stop would be the gates of hell. When Lionel reached the first boxcar, he ran to the door and threw it open. The frozen wind whipped by, screaming in his ears. The conductor called out to him to come back inside. The man began hurriedly moving towards Lionel, and the zombie-like patrons of the train stood up to help the conductor pull him back in. This is it. Now is his only chance to escape. Taking a deep breath, he leapt through the door into the ominous black void before him. And suddenly, everything went black, and he felt a searing pain in the back of his head. He opened his eyes, again with blurred vision. Sitting up and shaking his head, he realized that he was back on the bridge. He had apparently fallen back onto the concrete, rather than the icy river below. Miraculously, his life had been spared. He carefully stood up and looked around at the cold fog which had encased the bridge. The city lights hazed through it, steady and strong. But there were other, more faint lights as well that elegantly floated in the crystallized air. Ghostly orbs were dancing in the darkness, and Lionel intuitively knew that they are the spirits of those who still haunt this place. In a strange sense, their presence somehow seemed to soothe him, giving him the strength to move forward as they safely guided him off the bridge. When his feet touched the earth, the orbs faded away. Lionel looked back at Hellgate and smiled. He had been given a second chance, and he was going to do things right this time. Lionel lived a long and happy life from that point forward. If only he had known his life would turn out this good, he never would have made it to the bridge on that faithful night. But he was glad that he did, because now he can fully appreciate all of the magical gifts that life has to offer. So tell me, my loves, did Lionel suffer some kind of delusion as a result of the head injury? Or did he in fact take a ride on the ghost train of Hellgate? Have you, yourself, been on a paranormal ride? Please comment down below and like and subscribe for more fictional stories that are often of actual urban legends and sometimes have historical reference. See you next week and have a good night.